Talking with Jerry.
Yes, it's Black History Month, and this is episode number 2 of week 1 on 2 Black history facts, things that happened here in America concerning African Americans that you weren't taught in school, and that I bet you probably don't even know. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Subscribe is very important so you can keep up with the content that I'm constantly posting. So the first thing I want to talk about is the father of our country, George Washington. Yes, George Washington owned slaves. He even purchased slaves. So we're going to talk briefly about one of the slaves that he purchased. His name was Henry Washington. He was George's stable boy in charge of his horses. He was purchased by George Washington in 1763. He had to work very long hours taking care of the hundreds of horses on George Washington's estate. And he first escaped in 1771. And he wasn't the only slave that George Washington owned that escaped. There was another famous slave, female that George Washington owned, and she went to Philadelphia, and she didn't want to return with George. She escaped, and he took out ads in the newspapers. It's a very famous case, petitioning to try to get her back, and he even wrote letters offering her a larger room in the house to stay, etc., etc. But that's a whole nother story. But this particular slave, Henry, when he ran away the first time he was captured. And this is a story about his life. And we pick up at the start of the American Revolution. So one day he goes to George Washington, who's at the time just this very wealthy landowner. And he says, Mr. Washington, there's rumors that there's going to be a war, that the colonists want to take up arms against the British and, kind of not do what the British want. And he didn't know too many details about King George and not wanting to continue to pay taxes, etc., and many other things were going on. But he heard rumors of a pending war against the British. So George Washington tells him, yes, that's true. And being an inquisitive young man, he says, well, Mr. Washington, if there is a war and you win freedom from the British and you're going to set up a whole new country and there'll be a new start, what happens to me? Am I going to be free? And George Washington looked at him and aghast and said, free? No, you'll still be my slave. So right away, immediately, it is believed that evening he ran away. Now, where did he run? He ran to the British lines, went to the British, and as the war was getting ready to break out, he's now a runaway slave. And what the British did at that time, this was in your history books, if you remember back when you were in school, at least in high school, you may have learned this, that loyalists were being given all kind of promises by the British Crown. And the slaves were told that if they came over to the British side, that they would be granted freedom. And promised some other things if the British won the American Revolution. So Henry decides that he's going to fight with the British for his freedom. And these soldiers, these black soldiers, were called the Dunmores of the the Dunmores of the Ethiopian regiment. They wore a white shirt. It was embroidered with the words "Liberty for slaves." Liberty for slaves. And they were fighting for their freedom against the Continental Army. Of course, we know that the Continental Army defeated the British and won the Revolutionary War. So you wonder what happened to those slaves and what happened to Henry. So Henry is rewarded because he knew a lot about George Washington. So of course the British valued him, and during the war he was very instrumental in helping them understand the mindset of George Washington. So he and a number of other African slaves who had run away, it is documented in a book called The Book of Negroes. Was documented by Brigadier General Samuel Birch. And in this book, he has the records, names, and descriptions of over 3,000 slaves who left to the British lines, leaving their slave master to seek refuge with the British or to even fight alongside the British to be free men. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, they took these people and they moved them up to primarily Nova Scotia. And they were left there to settle on land to set up their own kind of free government, as Nova Scotia was just beginning as its own kind of country, and they were left there. But unfortunately, many of the white settlers did not like them, and George, he knew how to write. He wrote back to the generals that he served with in the British Army. Wrote back to England, and he said that we, meaning the people that he was with, the other slaves that were brought there, were very unhappy. It was also very cold. There were a number of other problems that they had, and the British general was so enamored with the fact that Henry had written them and asked what other options were they, that they sent the ship or ships to pick them up and then take them back to Africa. And they took them to Sierra Leone. And they were there in Sierra Leone and on the west coast of Africa for many years. And the ship would come every so many months and bring them supplies so that they could survive. But unfortunately, some civil war broke out between different groups in the area. The British had established a colony there. Henry got caught up in some of the fighting. It is not known what happened to him. I've done some research. The Book of Negroes states that maybe, something happened. They went back one or two times. No one knew what happened to Henry. Then there were other reports that he was killed in some type of an uprising. So that's one of the short, brief stories I wanted to tell you about a Black history fact about a slave owned by George Washington that you probably never heard of. The other story also begins in the early part of this country's history, as we talked about in episode, the last episode, part 1 for Black History Month, of the 2 episodes to be done for this first week of Black History. And that has to do with, again, New York City, which at the time was New Amsterdam. And there was an area where the Dutch settled called Land of the Blacks. And you might say, well, why did they call this area the Land of the Blacks? Well, it was called Land of the Blacks because in the tip of Manhattan, the Dutch built a wall to defend against the Indians attacking them. The Lenape tribe was the native tribe on Manhattan Island. And in case the Indians came by canoe, because the Dutch had settled at the end of the city, Lower Manhattan, they built this wall. To this day, that's where the name Wall Street comes from, because in Lower Manhattan, Wall Street, that's where this wall was to repel the Indians attacking the Dutch in Lower Manhattan. But they had to worry about, well, what about from the northern part of Manhattan if the Indians come and attack us that way? What are we going to do? How are we going to know that they're coming? You know, what can we think of? We can't afford to build this wall all across northern Manhattan. So they let the black people, many of whom were free, settle in the northern part of the city, in an area which now is the Village and Soho, very ritzy parts of Manhattan. And the reason they let them settle there, and this is the government at that time, though it wasn't the U.S. government, is because if the Indians were going to attack coming from the north, they would attack and kill the black people first. And then a little further south in Manhattan, the Dutch white people would see the black people's homes on fire. They would see them running. They would see, people trying to get away from the attack of the Native Americans. And then they would have an opportunity to prepare themselves for a coming attack if it was a large group of Indians coming down from the northern part of Manhattan into the southern part to attack them. So that's just another brief story about what happened at the beginning of the start of America, before it was even 13 colonies, when the Dutch were in New York City, which at the time was called New Amsterdam, before the British sailed into New York Harbor and threatened to blow up and shoot cannons and destroy the whole Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. And Peter Stuyvesant surrendered to the British, and then they took over in the 1660s. So it's just interesting the way you can look at history and say, from the very beginning of this country's history, before it was 13 colonies, before it was United States of America, we have the Dutch settling in New York City, which was New Amsterdam. Even at that time, actions by the government that was in place at that beginning of New York City was putting things in place that adversely affected whether African Americans, black people, whether they were free or slave, would live or not, and that they would be in a position of being harmed or for the protection of other people. So once again, just another short story. Hope you enjoyed it. Something that you didn't know before. Don't forget to subscribe. Happy Black History Month.